Hi everyone, as a part of this video, I am going to discuss about what is test documentation or what do you mean by test documentation. So as a simple term, we can say that everything about test we should document in a place or we should document in a notepad or maybe in Excel, right? Basically, something we need to document in a area or in a Excel or in a notepad. So that is called as test documentation. So this is a very simple or general term. So everything about the testing, we should need to update something in maybe notepad, maybe Excel, or maybe Word. So that document is called as a test documentation. But now, if we see this as a software testing, then what do you mean by test documentation? The test documentation is a documentation of artifacts which created before or during the testing of software. Which created before the testing of a software or during the testing of a software. So that is called test documentation. So basically, the test documentation is a documentation of artifacts created. Test documentation is created before or during the testing of a software. So whenever we are doing any kind of testing, so at that runtime or the before, we need to make some documentation that is called as a test documentation. Now, what artifacts we need to create? The artifact maybe the something the test coverage, resource tracking, effort estimate, then execution progress, means how much time we will take to complete any testing. That time we need to update on that test documentation. Then what is the test coverage, or how many resources are working for that particular software for the testing. So that everything we need to update on the test documentation. Okay, so test documentation is a documentation of artifact that is created before or during the testing of a software. And also it helps the testing team to estimate the testing effort, test coverage, resource tracking, execution progress, etc. Okay, so now test documentation, it is a complete suite of documents. It's a complete suite of documents because every documents we need to update on the test documentation. That may be the testing time effort, maybe the test coverage, maybe the resource tracking, maybe the execution process, etc, etc. So everything we need to update on the test documentation. So that's why test documentation is a complete suite of documents that allows you to describe and document what? Test planning, test design, test execution, test result, test report, everything that are drawn from the testing activity. So whatever we are getting from the testing activity, whatever we are getting from the testing execution, like maybe the test planning, the test designing, test execution, test result, test report, everything we need to document on that test documentation. So that's why test documentation is a complete suite of documents that allows you to describe and document test planning, test designing, test execution, test result, which are drawn from the testing activity. Okay, so this is the simple definitions of test documentation. So now you guys are very much clear about what do you mean by test documentation. Now, next thing is that some types are there for the test documentation. So how many types are there? Lots of types are there. Almost 7 to 8 types are there. Like one is test policy, then test strategy, then test plan, then requirement testability matrix or RTM, then test scenario, test case, test data, defect report. So these are the types of test documentation. So almost 8 types are there. Okay, so these are the types of test documentation. So test policy, test strategy, test plan, requirement testability matrix, test scenario, test case, test data, and the defect report. So these are the 8 types of test documentations we have. So these are the types of test documentation. So in my upcoming videos, I will create the separate video for all of these. So all of these I'll create separate video. So don't worry about that. Just follow me, and at the end you will get everything from my side. Okay, so no issues. So as a part of this test documentation video, I can only say that there are only 8 types we followed. That is test policy, test strategy, test plan, requirement testability matrix, test scenario, test case, test data, and defect report. So in my upcoming video, I will update for all, I mean each and every topic for a single video. Okay, so no problem, no issues. Now coming to the next topic is that, so here is also one test report that is called as a test documentation types, that is test summary report. So one is the defect report, one is the test summary report. Okay, so these are the 9 test documentation types are there. These are the 9 test documentation types we followed: test policy, test strategy, test plan, requirement testability matrix, test scenario, test case, test data, defect report, and test summary report. So these are the 9 test documentation types we follow. Okay, now coming to the next one is that, what is the importance of test documentation? And this is the most important thing of test documentation. Why we use the test documentation? Why we write the test documentation? So these are the importance of test documentation. So the importance of test documentation is that, so the general opinion about the testing documentation is that anyone who has free time can do the documentation, like a test case, test plan, bug report, project proposal, status report, etc. Okay, so the general opinion about the testing documentation is that anyone or anybody who has free time, okay, so he can do the documentation. So what in which basis we do the documentation? The basis on that test cases, test plan, test report, bug report, project proposal. So these are the basic things that whoever is free, he can update that everything in that test documentation. So I myself won't trace more about the documentation, but I can say it it's my habit to place all the data in a black and white and to update others as well about that. Okay, so everything in your in your career or in your organizations or in your project, for your project, my opinion is that please do a test documentation. So if you use the test documentation, at the end, so there is lots of confusion will be clear. Like, so what are the confusion, why we need the test documentation? So I will understand everything, or I will tell everything in this video. Okay, now the importance of the test documentation is that, just for example, we have delivered a project. Okay, so just for example, we have delivered a project with an in that project we know that we have a unknown issue. Okay, so we have delivered a project with an unknown issue to one of our clients, and let's say the client is very angry. So angry client. So we have delivered a project with an unknown issue to one of our clients. The client is, let's say the client is very angry. Okay, so the issue was found on the client side. Now whenever we hand over our project to the or our software to the customer or client, now let's say there is one issue was found from the client end, and it was a very bad situation for us. Why? Because as usual, all the blame was on the QS, because we test the software, then we hand over the software to the customer, to the client. Now in the client end, if any issue found, then obviously the client will directly blame to us or directly blame to the QA person. So let's say that the issue was something regarding the compatibility of one website. So when it came to me, I was having proof that I didn't get such a requirement document which stated that I have to check the compatibility of the website as well. Okay. So I did not get such type of requirement document which stated that I have to check the compatibility of the website as well. Because when the requirement came to my end, or when the requirement came to the QA person, then in that requirement document, there is nothing right like that we have to check in every browser, or we have to check the compatibility. Okay. Now the compatibility issues came to the client end. Now obviously client will blame to us. Then what is the what we will do? If we write the test documentation, then we can say that, or I can say that I am in a good safe. I am in a safe zone, because everything I have documented in a test documentation. So what is the test strategy follow, what is the test report, what is the test cases, what is the test requirement, what is the project proposal, everything we documented in a test documentation. So that's why when the client blame to a QA person, then the QA person directly give the test documentation to the client and say, hey, we don't have this type of requirement, because I write everything in my test documentation, you can see that. So I am in a safe zone. Okay. So then we can easily handle this kind of situation from the client side. So that's why test documentation is a very much needed. Okay. Right, guys? Clear my point? So these are the importance of test documentation. So because we have a proof, because everything we have documented, so we have a proof. So if the client blame to us, blame to the QA person, then the QA person directly raise his hand and say, hey, everything we have documented, you can see my test documentation. So whatever issue you are checking, or whatever issue you found, that is not in the test documentation, that is not in your test case, that is not in your business scenario, then how can you blame me? Right? So these are the importance of test documentation. Clear? Now coming to the next, what are the advantages of test documentation? So few advantages are there. Obviously there is few advantages, because as of now you can see that I have told you lots of thing like what is the importance of test documentation. Then obviously we can say few advantages of that importance. Like, so what are the advantages? So the main reason behind creating the test documentation is to either reduce or remove any uncertainties about the testing activities. Okay, and helps you to remove ambiguity which often arises when it comes to the allocations of task. Clear? So this is the, one of the biggest advantage of the test documentation. So test documentation is to either reduce or remove any uncertainties about the testing activities, and helps us to remove ambiguity which often arises when it's come to the allocations of task. Then second point is that test documentation not only offers a systematic approach to the software testing, but it also acts as training material to freshers in the software testing process. Now how? Now suppose, let's say you are the QA in your project, and let's say this project is running from almost since 3 years. Since 3 years your project is running and you are the only QA. Now you left the company and one new QA member is joined. Now he don't have any idea about the project. Then how he start to testing? So it was very difficult for him, right? So if we use the test documentation, then easily for the freshers or for the newly joining or for the new joinee, it will be very helpful for them, because they can easily read the test documentation and easily test everything and easily know how, what is the software, or what we are going to do, like everything about the testing he can easily follow from that test documentation. So that's why documentation not only offers a systematic approach to a software testing, but it also acts as training material to freshers in the software testing process. Okay. And point number 3, it is also a good marketing and sales strategy to showcase test documentation to exhibit a mature testing process. So for the good marketing and for the good sales strategy, we can show our test documentation. So then the marketing guys or the sales guys, he can easily see our test documentation, and he can assume that we have a we are we already did some mature testing in that software, because we have documented everything in the test documentation. So that's why it's also a good marketing and sales strategy to showcase test documentation to exhibit a mature testing process, right? And point number 4, the test documentation helps us to offer a quality product to the client within specific time limits. In the specific time limits, we can give some quality product to the client. Okay. And the number 6 is that test documentation helps us to improve transparency with the client, because the I have already told you in the test documentation what we document. Lots of things we document, like the resource stacking, the testing effort, the execution progress, the resource stacking, test coverage, test designing, test planning, test execution, test proposal. So everything we documented in the test documentation. So that's why test documentation also helps us to improve the clear transparency with the client. So we don't have any ambiguity with the client. Okay, we have a clear transparency with the client for that test documentation. Okay, so these are the advantages of test documentation. Now coming to the next one is that disadvantages of test documentation. So what are the disadvantages of the test documentation? So obviously it is very costly, because everything, so that documentation may suffer at its value, as it is very time consuming. That's why, as it is very time consuming, so the cost of the documentation may suppress its value. Okay, then it will take time. Now why? Because as a tester, as a QA, we have to write the test documentation. Everything we have to write. So for that purpose, if we use the test documentation, then we need much more time. Okay, so I mean, many times time should be needed. So from the short time of period, we cannot use the test documentation. So if we have to submit the project within 2 or 3 days, then we don't go for the test documentation, because for the test documentation we need some time. Okay. And then next, the many times it is written by people who cannot write well or who don't know the material. So this is the most disadvantage. So who write the test documentation, obviously he should some good knowledge, from writing knowledge or some material knowledge must be present, must be needed. So that's why it is written by people who cannot write well or who don't know the material. Then next one is that keeping track of changes requested by the client and updating corresponding the documentation is tiring, because every time, obviously every time the client will change their requirement. So as the client is changing their requirement, then obviously we have to update that requirement to the test documentation again. So how many times the client will change their change their business requirement, then we have to go and update our test documentation. Okay, so that's why keeping track of changes requested by the client and updating corresponding the documentation is tiring. Okay, and the next one is that poor documentation is directly reflects to the quality of the product, as a misunderstanding between the client and the organization can occur. So if we write some poor documentation, so let's say whoever or who has written the test documentation, if he cannot write well or if he don't know the material, then the documentation should be the documentation should be poor. So that's why poor documentation directly reflects to the quality of the product. So if the documentation is not good, then the product quality will be not good. So everything will connected with each other. So everything is connected with each other. So poor documentation directly reflect to the quality of the product. And also there is some misunderstanding between the client and the organization. So these are the disadvantages of test documentation. So now you guys are very much clear about what is test documentation. Okay. So I think this video will be very helpful to you. If if you guys have any doubt, please comment me. If you guys like my video, one thumbs up and share this video to your nearest friend and subscribe to my channel EduPaat. So see you in the next videos with some another topic of software testing. Thank you.